Good morning, everyone, and for our friends and colleagues based in Asia or Europe, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Central Asia Program seminars. My name is Sébastien Pérouse. I'm a research professor working with the Central Asia Program at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. So, sadly, we have seen over the past 2 years many clashes at the Kyrgyz-Tajik border, and the latest one occurred just last month in September and was particularly violent with, unfortunately, dozens of dead and injured people. And there's even raised many questions on the causes, for example, of the conflict, on the commitment of the political authorities to find solutions, on the means to help reconciliation between the two countries, and also between the Tajik and Kyrgyz population living around the borders. So to address this sensitive issue today, we have 3 of the best experts working on Central Asia: Asel Doolotkeldieva, Madeleine Reeves, and Parviz Mulogjanov. So each speaker is going to present about 10 minutes. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So please feel free to send me your questions or to me or in the chat box. So we're going to start with Dr. Asel Doolotkeldieva. Asel is a senior lecturer at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek. She earned her PhD from the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, also in politics. And before working for the OSCE Academy, Asel was a visiting fellow at College Mondial at the FMSH in Paris, in France, and at the ZMO in Berlin, Germany. Asel works on many topics, including on revolts and politics of populism, mobilization, and protests, and as well on the political economy of resource extraction in Central Asia. And now she is leading a research project on protests and mass revolts in Central Asia. So Asel, thank you so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sebastian, for such a nice introduction. Hello to everyone. Just maybe a couple of words about my positionality. Since the beginning, I'm not an expert on border disputes like Madeleine is, our next speaker. But I came to view these issues from the point of social mobilizations and the populism regarding also natural resources and land. So, okay, I'm gonna structure my 10 minutes talk around 3 points. The first is I'm simply gonna tell descriptively what happened in this recent events. And the second part of my talk, I will try to actually analyze this event and how particularly they are different from the previous border disputes. I think it's really important to understand that there is a shift in nature in border conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And in the third part, in the final part, I will try to address the immediate implications for domestic politics in both countries, and also the regional security, and specifically the implications for local communities. Okay, so for those of you who didn't follow this event closely, what happened is that on the 14th of September, so a little bit less than a month, there was an exchange of fire between Kyrgyz and Tajik border guards at the Ekitash border post. The next day, there was a ceasefire, but on the 16th, the shelling resumed. And this is happening actually while both presidents of both countries and actually other presidents are sitting in Samarkand at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. hosted by Uzbekistan. Neither of the parties, neither the host of the summit, raised the issue that there are actual hostilities taking place just some 250 kilometers away from Samarkand, and both President Japarov and Rahmon they had a side talk where they tried to negotiate a ceasefire. But nevertheless, the exchange of fire continued until the 18th of September. This produced quite heavy losses in human life and casualties. On the Kyrgyz side, there were 63 deaths, most of which is among the military. Then about 200 casualties among the civilians, and more than 600 houses destroyed, and not mentioning social infrastructure, schools, businesses, farms being destroyed on the Kyrgyz side. On the Tajik side, there is, as usual, scarcity of information. We only know from the official sources there were 41 human losses, and several dozens of houses and one school destroyed. But maybe Pravis later on can correct me on this if there is a new information on that. So, of course, this is not the first incident on the border areas between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. There is actually quite a long history of those conflicts, and Madeleine, who's an expert on this issue, probably will come back to that thing. But if we talk about the then post-independence period, there was an intensification of border disputes, specifically after 2010. And according to Kyrgyz state officials, this was due that basically both countries began delimitation work in the valley. Before, the delimitation was taking place in the mountainous areas, and therefore there was not much disputes happening. But then when the delimitation work came to the valley, there were a lot of disputes around roads, pastures, water management, and so on and so forth. So the peak of incidents took place in 2014. Overall, in the past 10 years, according to the Kyrgyz Border Service official information, there were more than 140 incidents taking place on the border areas. Presumably, majority of those disputes were around the Boruch enclave. But this is not to say that what happened in September is exactly within the lines of this the so-called usual border disputes, which in Russian actually are called хозяйственные споры. Yeah. My contention is that what happened in September of this year and in April of the last year is of a different nature. This can be better described as a military incursion and invasion of territory. So there are several elements which kind of lead to that direction. First of all, this time there was the usage of a heavy military equipment, including mortar on the Tajik side. Second of all, the geography of shelling was really quite expensive this time. 8 military border posts. I'm trying to really, I'm using the microphone and I'm trying to speak loud, but I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I think, well, we can hear you, but it's true that it's a little bit difficult. Asel, I think there's a problem of connection of your side. I'm really sorry. Indeed, I see that you're making efforts to talk very close to the microphone. I mean, you're doing your best. I'm really sorry. I apologize. I mean, it's really totally independent of what we can do here. So yes, if you could still try to talk as close as possible to the microphone. Sorry.
Sure. So I was saying that the geography got expanded. So there were 8 border services on the Kyrgyz side that were attacked at a time. And there were new posts which were included this time, which are much deeper into the Kyrgyz territory. This is the Batken city itself and the Chongalai area. And neither Batken city or Chongalai are disputed areas. So the shelling was taking place where there are no disputes this time. Fourth, So it was very clear from the casualties taking place, specifically among the Kyrgyz military, that the Kyrgyz military were unprepared for this incursion. And that's why they carried such heavy losses in the first days. The last point is that specifically the social infrastructure, the houses, the schools and kindergarten and animal stock were targeted, and not some border posts or disputed areas. This really raises a lot of questions. So the questions that we are all asking right now is they're manifold, right? So how come that this heavy military equipment somehow became operational and within the confines of the Baruch enclave? How did it happen that it was stored there, that without the Kyrgyz side knowing about such military movements? Second of all, what was the goal and purpose of using such heavy weapons and destroying specifically the social infrastructure? Is it to grab land and therefore create a corridor between Baruch and the mainland, while basically the international community is busy with Ukraine and the Kyrgyz president is not at home? The chronology of events is also very unclear. We don't have information what really happened, how actually what triggered the exchange of fire between the both sides. In the previous conflicts, there was always some sort of provocations which would lead to the involvement of the border guards. This time, we don't know such information. So, and the other questions would be kind of if this was a prepared incursion into the Kyrgyz territory, how well it was orchestrated by the top leadership in Tajikistan, right? These questions and these elements of the analysis lead to the suggestion that this border disputes are not anymore about Soviet legacy. They are more related. They are more related to the current contemporary domestic politics in both countries. And here, I hope that we will be able to discuss this. I would like to learn more from my Tajik colleague, what is happening in Tajikistan. Why does Rahmon still need to consolidate his nation around his transit of power? I thought that there is no need to consolidate anymore because he basically destroyed the last source of resistance in Nagorno-Karabakh. So that seems like there is still a need to create an external enemy, which is right now Kyrgyzstan. And there is some expansionist politics behind, which was very clearly also observable on social media and stuff. So in my last part, I'm going to very briefly address the immediate implications. So the first order of implications are for the regional security. Right now, Kyrgyzstan is moving away from the ODKB, the CSTO organization. It refused recently to participate in the military training hosted both in Kyrgyzstan and later in Tajikistan. It also addressed already the CSTO to change the charter, to introduce measures that basically such hostilities do not take place anymore between the members of the organization. But the implications are also of a big concern for the local communities. Right now, there is a condition of no return for local communities, specifically in those villages like Maksat, International, Aksai, where the majority of houses, businesses, and animal stock were destroyed and cannot be restored anymore. So how the local people are able to return and continue and resume their lives as usual. So this is a big question. There is right now really the atmosphere of uncertainty, of fear, whether hostilities will resume or not. So this is, of course, a big concern for Kyrgyz authorities. But I'm also more concerned about of course, the rise of nationalism inside the Kyrgyz society. Right now, members of parliament are suggesting, I'm finishing in 1 minute, even less so. Right now, there are members of parliament who are suggesting, for example, voluntary mobilization, but also to distribute arms and weapons to local people so that they can defend themselves. Such proposals resonate among some part of the society. For example, some local people say that if the state cannot protect them, if the state cannot protect those border areas, then people, the ordinary people, should be able to do it themselves. So there is, of course, one can understand such sentiments, but this is a very dangerous turn. There are very much militant discourses around the sacralization of land, of natural resources is taking place. So inside Kyrgyzstan right now, there is still a lot of mourning, a lot of uncertainty and fears about this recent incursion. And we don't know simply how now this border will be managed, whether there is a chance for border delimitation, because it shows clearly that without a third party mediation, both countries probably at this point in time will be unable to come together and negotiate an effective border delimitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asel, for your presentation. Again, we're really sorry about these technical issues. I mean, we're very dependent on that, and sometimes we cannot control them as well as we wish. So sorry again. Our next speaker is Madeleine Reeves. Madeleine is a professor in the anthropology of migration at the University of Oxford. Madeleine has published extensively on mobility, space, and power along the borders of Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. She has also published a lot and worked a lot on debt migration and documentary strategies among Kyrgyzstani migrant workers in Moscow, and on ethnicity conflict and infrastructure in southern Kyrgyzstan. So Madeleine, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for the invitation to take part. And I want to begin just by expressing my condolences for all those who've been affected by the violence and for all those who are still currently affected by loss of property and loss of life. So there are three aspects of the recent escalation of conflict on the Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan border that I want to comment on in the 10 minutes allotted to me. The first concerns what we might call the scale, severity, and political significance of the recent escalation of conflict. The second concerns the interpretative frames through which we try to make sense of what happened. And the third concerns some of the possible implications. Asel mentioned some of the implications for the CSTO, and I want to draw attention as well to the implications for borderland populations. In terms of my background and my positionality for talking about these issues, I've conducted long-term ethnographic fieldwork on both sides of the Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan border, particularly in the Isfara Valley, that's to say in and around Varokh, Aksai, Kapchigai, Samanyon, and Kuktash, some of the villages that were already mentioned in Asel's presentation. And it's that part of the Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan border that I know the best. And I think that's worth stressing, since I think the particular dynamics of the conflict in different parts of the border region are distinct, just as there are particular histories of border conflict and militarization. So I'm mostly going to be talking about the Isfara Valley. So firstly, on questions of scale and intensity and political significance. As Asel already alluded, the escalation of violence that happened last month between September the 14th and 17th, while time limited, was of a different order from previous episodes, including the hitherto most serious escalation of violence in April 2021, when 55 people were killed following clashes around the Galavnoy water station. The cumulative death toll on both sides of the borders from September 22 numbers around 140. That is based on open source data compiled by Radio OSCE, the Tajik language service of Radio Free Europe, and Radio Azatuk. Those figures may grow, and they are greater in both cases than the official figures. On both sides of the border, there were both military and civilian deaths. Hundreds of people were injured, and over 140,000 Kyrgyzstani citizens were displaced, many of whom remain in temporary accommodation, living with relatives or in makeshift dormitory accommodation. And I'll return to that a little bit in a moment when I discuss the implications, as well as the significant loss of domestic property and damage to infrastructure that Asel has already spoken of. For the moment, I just want to stress that for all Central Asia watchers, these events, while temporally confined to a few days in September, and now, as so often, sort of off the immediate news agenda, are, I think, profoundly consequential for the whole region, for its stability, for domestic politics, for interstate relations, and for the future of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, of which Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are both notionally members. So I want to elaborate on these three aspects of this significance and shift in scale. First, the events were much more severe than previous escalations, both in terms of the kind of military weaponry that was used, as Asel has said, but also in terms of the simultaneity of conflict along different parts of the border that are relatively disparate and at a geographical distance from one another, including Chongalai district in Osh Oblast, which is quite far from previous sites of escalation along the borders of Batken. And this gives credence, I think, to assertions on the part of the Kyrgyzstani authorities that the attacks appeared to be planned and coordinated. The attacks were also significant in terms of the scale of devastation of civilian infrastructure, including schools, kindergartens, large numbers of domestic properties and businesses, including attacks on residential areas seemingly at some distance from the border, as well as the apparent involvement of paramilitary groups. Open source maps of fire damage, as well as interviews and my own conversations with people from affected villages, suggest the systematic and disproportionate targeting of homes and infrastructure on the Kyrgyzstan side of the border, with, it would seem to me from the evidence currently available, the intention of making certain of these border villages de facto unlivable because of the ever-present threat of repeat attacks. Now, I want to qualify that statement and stress that the kind of proviso from the information currently available, because one of the challenges that analysts face is that the information landscape is both polarized and highly circumscribed, and there is urgent need for systematic, independent investigation and for making the results of any such investigation available for scrutiny by the publics of both states. And third, the third aspect in which this sort of escalation, I think, differs from previous episodes of violence here is, I think, in its implications in terms of bringing issues of Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan interstate relations and the border issue more generally into the public arena with a new intensity. We've seen that with the mobilization of civil society. We've seen that with the amplification of nationalist rhetoric in both states on social media and so forth. And if previously the border issue, the Chegara Maselesi in Kyrgyz, was often seen in Kyrgyzstan, at least in Bishkek, as a sort of distant problem confined to Batken, I think this public investment in the border issue is one reason why I'm concerned about the sort of long-range implications, and that while we have an official commitment to the withdrawal of troops, the closure of border posts and the signing of protocols, my concern is that this won't satisfy the very real public sentiment on both sides of the border, and the kind of enduring sense of insecurity and instability. So that's my first point, which concerns scale, severity, and significance. My second point concerns the interpretive frames we use to make sense of what happened. And Asel has already alluded to the kind of tendency in the Russian media discourse to refer to хозяйственные споры. In the Anglophone sort of international analysis of what's going on, I think there's a tendency to get the scale of analysis wrong. Either we get sort of headlines to the effect that this is squabbling in Russia's backyard, problematically, I think, centering Russia in the analysis, or sort of an assumption that this is simply a continuation by other means of a local border skirmish. The New York Times just this Monday, for instance, evidenced both of these descriptive tendencies by framing discussion of events under the headline, quotes, "A distracted Russia is losing its grip on its old Soviet sphere," while also describing Batken region as characterized by, quotes, "a jumble of rival ethnic groups who, armed with farm implements, have for decades skirmished sporadically in what they call shovel wars." And so much of the international reporting on this region is sort of fly in, fly out analysis in which Russia is assumed to be the central actor. Now, in making this point, I don't want to sort of imply that it's not important either to attend to geopolitics or to understand the complex historical reasons why Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan disagree over maps and protocols and the terminations of Soviet-era parity commissions, and why it is that certain villages and residential districts are particularly sensitive and contested spaces today. Indeed, on the contrary, I think there is a real need for serious archival investigation of, for instance, the ways that parity commissions conducted their work and the forms of exchange, the loans of land in exchange for water allocation, for instance, that have created such profound disagreement and resentment today. There's also a real need for the sustained analysis for the kind of everyday grievances that can easily get inflamed at times of wider conflict, everything from concerns about people throwing stones at passing cars to cows trampling sown fields and so forth. In other words, there's a need for the kind of analysis that long-term ethnography affords. And and I also want to not sort of downplay the significance of the wider geopolitical context, in particular for understanding why it is that Russia is no longer seen as a guarantor of security in Central Asia, particularly in Kyrgyzstan, and why it is that the CSTO has lost any veneer of credibility in acting as a guarantor of regional peace. So the geopolitical configuration is not unimportant, but I think interpreting events exclusively through the lens of other nation states, notably Russia and China, ignores those aspects of domestic politics in both states that have created the preconditions over the last years, really, for the border issue to be mobilized for domestic political ends. A dynamic that has gone on for years as securitization, militarization, and de facto delimitation through the building of border infrastructure has proceeded without a real political commitment to delimiting the border in a juridical sense. In other words, I think our analyses need to foreground accounts of populist nationalism in Kyrgyzstan and authoritarian consolidation in Tajikistan. And this gets me to the third broad point that I want to make in my intervention, which concerns the short and medium term implications of the latest escalation of violence. And I have to say that as a long-term observer of the Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan border, I feel few grounds for optimism at the moment. I'm often asked what are the potentials for peace in the region. And in the past, I've tended to emphasize the many grounds for coexistence that local residents themselves often mentioned in interview. The fact that forefathers had lived here side by side, the fact that there are well-developed local mechanisms for resolving disputes and so on. But I think one of the shifts that I feel has really shifted, and it's been a gradual shift over the last years, but has intensified in the last weeks, I think is a sense that the possibilities for coexistence really have been exhausted, that there is too much existential threat, particularly when families come to imagine a viable future for their children in the Atajer, in the homeland. And I think on the Kyrgyz side of the border, this is coupled with a very real demographic anxiety, one that I think is often missed in both capital cities and international analyses, which is to say that while the population of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan nationally are not significantly different, locally those demographic indicators are very different. And that plays, I think, in particular in Kyrgyzstan into sort of existential concerns about security, and play into what Asel has already alluded to, this sort of concern about the impossibility of return. It also, I think, serves to escalate a kind of nationalist rhetoric in which the only way to resolve a long duration border dispute is seen to escalate the threat of force, right? So Asel mentioned parliamentary deputies talking about the importance of arming local populations. There are discussions about setting up local voluntary militias and so forth. And I have a real concern that this will just sort of exacerbate this cycle of violence. I'll end there. I want to leave time for our third speaker and also for questions at the end, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. So our third speaker is Parviz Molodjanov. Dr. Parviz Molodjanov, who is a political scientist and a historian. He's a former visiting researcher at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, a visiting professor at Whitman College in the USA, and visiting scholar at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, at the University of Heidelberg in Germany, and the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, EHESS Paris, and research fellow at the Catering Foundation in the USA. Parviz is a former chairman of the board of the Tajik branch of the Open Society Institute and a former member of EU and Central Asia Monitoring and Research Group. So Parviz, very welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today. I just would like to remind that after Parviz's presentation, we will have a Q&A. So please feel free to send your question in the chat box. Thank you, and Parviz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry because we also have some connections problems here in Dushanbe. Thank you very much. I will try to be very concise. Actually, just in the beginning, I would like to stress that this is, I'm not representing any organization. This is just my reading of the situation. And first of all, I would like to suggest in such gathering to avoid accusatory rhetorics, because it would turn such conversation to nowhere. I mean, that's just to stalemate and meaningless exchange of facts and arguments, the majority of which actually require detailed fact-checking. Before coming here, while preparing for this discussion, I actually traced the Tajik and Kyrgyz social media, and I found out actually that they always they use the same type of rhetorics, the same type of arguments and accusations. For each type of accusation from the Kyrgyz side, there is a similar accusation from the Tajik one. So let's put such definitions like who is aggressor, who started, who not, for social media. Or let's it would be done by an independent research group or independent group of experts. So they would be able to judge arguments from one side and the arguments from another side, and then to come up with some definitions and the accusations. And so far, for instance, for me, I mean, I also checked the both sides arguments. I think that's too early. For instance, in terms of who actually, I mean, the accusation, the mutual accusation, who started, who prepared, and then the same actually arguments is used by both sides. Like the Tajik say that it was launched and prepared by Kyrgyzstan because of internal situation to divert public attention, and exactly the same arguments are used by the Kyrgyz observers in social media. I mean, in my opinion, actually, I don't buy it. I mean, both for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Why? Because I don't see logic behind that behavior, either in terms of the Tajik government or Kyrgyz government. Just because, yes, I mean, sometimes a government would try to divert the public attention by organizing a small victorious war. and to strengthen his own position, like it was actually done by many countries before, like in 2014 by Russia and Ukraine. But in this case, you would have to have some considerable advantage. So you have military advantage, first of all. So to be able to launch and to finish and to conduct such victorious war. I don't see this the case for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, because we have a total military parity, and there would not any discussion about the victory. There would be no victory. There would be no winning side, and this is understood by the both governments. And for the Tajik side, I'm not so aware about the internal politics in Kyrgyzstan, because I'm not specialist in Kyrgyzstan, but I believe that for Tajikistan, the major concern, according to my reading, my meetings and contacts, this is Afghanistani border. And in the Tajikistani government, the situation in Batken perceived as a considerable threat, because it's a kind of opening a new front line, a second front line, which is not in the interest of the government. Plus, the security of concern is prevailed. So I don't see any kind of such preparations, because I know that since 2021 conflict, there was instruction from the Tajik government to local communities and local authorities not to respond to the actions from the Kyrgyz side, because they wanted to succeed with the negotiation as soon as possible. And I think that the same is, you can see that, for instance, when you are preparing such a war, such an aggression, first of all, you have to start from the informational warfare. You have to unleash some information campaign in the media, in the social media, in the printing media, etc., inside and beyond the country. And we don't see this, for instance, in Tajikistan, because in contrary, we have instruction from the government to the pro-government media not to tackle the question of border issues at all. And then whatever we have about the arguments and facts and data, everything is coming from independent bloggers and social media. And the same, I believe, the same situation in Kyrgyzstan, because for Japarov, as much as I know, the situation is very tense. So opening such war with such parity situation, military parity situation, would be dangerous for the both countries, for internal stability, and both governments understand that. So the question arises: so what happened, and while we have this new conflict, new outbursts of the conflict right now, I think that the major reason is the level of tension. So this is a total stalemate for the last 2 years. The stalemate of in negotiation process, no progress at all. And this doubled by the militarization of the border area. And then the militarization of the arm race. And this is one of the major reasons why the tension is so high. When the tension is so high, any incident can cause a larger scale of clashes. What can happen in many other instances, like for instance, in Pakistani-Indian borders, we have the same problems. When you have such a tension, you have usually such problem. Why the negotiation process is in a stalemate? There are just because actually whatever proposed by both sides is not acceptable for them. So both sides, they understand that there would be no victory. Both sides would like to find a solution, but whatever is proposed is not acceptable by both sides. In terms of Tajikistan, as I know, since in March 2021, Tajikistan was proposed actually an ultimatum. When Tashev entered the negotiation room, as I was told by the witnesses, he started from the words saying that, so we start from zero, no results of the previous negotiation would be accepted. So we are proposing you either exchange of land. So you will get extended Varuk. We will allocate for you some land on the border, or we start the delimitation on our own conditions. Of course, it was unacceptable for the Tajik side, because you would get, you have to give up a territory with the infrastructure which was constructed for hundreds of years, and then you get instead of just a desert with no infrastructure, no remuneration, it was discussed at all. And it was actually a stalemate which has started since that time. I'm not blaming just the Kyrgyz side, because there was also some rigid positions and rigid proposals from the Tajik side, as I know. But actually, whatever we have now, this is a total stalemate. And so this total stalemate, actually, if there would be no progress in the future, in the near future, in the forthcoming months, we would have the repetition of the same conflict as we used to have right now. We would have the repetition every 3-4 months, and the scale would be also increasing. Talking about the recent conflict, I would like just to stress that what strikes me personally is that if previously these clashes used to start from the, first of all, from the some fightings and disputes between civilians, and then militaries just interfered, or sometimes in the beginning militaries or frontiers just started to separate the sides. What we see now in the last 2 years, especially during the last conflict, is that the clashes started right away from the militaries without any involvement from civic population and civilians, which implies that this is already higher tension on the border. Plus, what struck me also, this is the language of hate and mutual nationalistic propaganda in both countries, which also not for the good for the both countries, and not for the good for the situation around the area around the conflict. And although, I mean, if we talk about the major clusters of causes, they're not so serious. It could be resolved. For instance, there is the first cluster. This is the land plots around the enclave Varuk, the illegal use of pastures and land, which could be resolved also. This is not a big issue. There is a water distribution problem, another cluster of problems. There are mechanisms of resolution of this issue, which was proposed and discussed many times in the previous years. There is a transportation problem, actually 2 roads from Isfahan and the Batken-Isfara, which is also, there are some prospects for some progress in the negotiation in those directions as well. So I think that what's happening, the process of negotiations right now is also the political will and the situation in the both countries. And we have some positive steps now. The delimitarization has been started right now. I mean, the last decision to separate, to withdraw the forces from the border, the taking forces from the four border posts. And then there should be some other progress in other directions, like there should be some discussions concerning the land issues, disputes concerning the infrastructure, the new mechanism of water and resources to simplify the scheme of water distribution, building trust between the sides, the management of water should be changed. So there should be ensured the sustainability of negotiation process. So there would be no any more such possibility for bringing the results, I mean, rejecting the results of the previous negotiations. So I will stop right now here, and then the question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Parviz, and thank you, Asel and Madeleine, again for this very interesting, I mean, insightful, and I would say measured presentations. As Parviz was saying, in these circumstances, it's extremely important to avoid the rhetoric of accusation. So I've received several questions. So we have about, well, a little bit more than 10 minutes left for this question. So the first one is, do you think that some criminal networks operating cross-nationally, for instance, drug trafficking, played any role in triggering this border conflict? Anyone wants to answer that?
According to the reports we have, there was smuggling of petroleum through the border. Both sides have been engaged, groups from both sides, big companies. There are also some smuggling of some trade products, goods to both sides. Usually it involved not paying taxes on the border, customs on the border, avoiding customs. With regard to the drug trafficking, the questions which was very frequently discussed, we don't have evidences. So therefore, I mean, it's usually speculative rhetorics. I mean, everybody talking about drug trafficking coming through Bishkek area. Everybody is talking that the conflict probably was inspired, promoted by those groups. But so far, we don't have such evidences. For instance, in terms of petroleum smuggling, we have evidences. We have data, we have names, we have name of companies, we have some ideas and information about the mechanism used. But in terms of the drug trafficking, sorry, I mean, we have to get something more tangible to make some conclusions.
Thank you, Parviz. Second question is, so we know that at least 140,000 people have been evacuated from the Bishkek area. So the questions are, where are they now, and what provisions are being made for the return and the reconstructions of destroyed houses, and who is going to pay for that?
Yeah, I can take this question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. If you can really talk close to the microphone. I'm so sorry about these technical issues again.
Sure. So the majority of the internally displaced people have returned to Bishkek. And just several days ago, we received the news that some of the houses began to be constructed either from scratch or so there were some already construction works that began. Of course, you have to know that we are approaching winter, and well, if the snow already will arrive, those families, especially with children, gonna be in a very difficult situation. Besides, of course, the reconstruction of houses, there are, I think, more than 10 schools and kindergarten that right now also needs to be rebuilt, and the usual kind of returning to normal life, such as going back to school for children, to work, this all has to resume. So far, we don't have really details about who's gonna reconstruct. We know that the Kyrgyz government has allocated significant amount of money for that, but we don't know yet whether the Kyrgyz government will be able to basically remedy this problem on its own. In the first aggression of 2021, there was some help, humanitarian help from Turkey, from international organizations, but this time we don't know yet. At least I didn't see such information yet.
Anyone? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Could I just add something on the internally displaced? I think it's sort of also important to distinguish those people who fled from neighboring villages because there was a generalized sense of fear that particularly when Bishkek town was attacked, and a lot of those people have indeed returned. But to my knowledge, a lot of people from the villages that have suffered the most severe fire damage, a lot of people haven't returned either because they're currently unable to return because their homes have been destroyed, or because they have been so traumatized that they feel that there's a sort of that they're very anxious at the prospect of return. So certainly I've spoken to people from Aksai and Kapchirai, which were villages that were very badly damaged. And the description that I was given was that people were still, by and large, either staying with relatives in Bishkek town or in neighboring villages, Akhtatyr, Samarkandek, other villages, or they were seeking refuge in dormitory accommodation in Bishkek. But I think the other dynamic that we might observe longer term is while many people are indeed trying to seek compensation, and there is a commission that has been set up where you know, you bring your Qizil Kitap, your red book, and you can register that your property has been damaged. Anecdotally, I hear accounts of people just trying to leave for Russia as a first sort of point of destination, as a place, you know, to be able to try to seek work. So there are, you know, I think that we're going to observe lots of different kinds of migratory dynamics.
Thank you. We have some questions on the reaction and the potential role of international organizations to during these events. I mean, to react to and to try to fix this event. So, do you think, for example, that an organization like the OSCE could help, or the United Nations, or do you think that that conflicting parties need actually the support of other countries like Turkey, Iran, or the European Union?
Usually in such cases, there should be, would be useful for the both sides to have a platform, which usually proposed by a third force, the third group, like the most appropriate and the most acceptable for both sides, like international organizations, could be a UN organization, CC, or some other organizations. I don't think that, for instance, the third countries would be able to provide such platform, or there could be some joint efforts made by both donor countries, external players, geopolitical players, and international organizations. Of course, the both teams, negotiation teams, they prefer, they state that they would like to have just two-side negotiations without involvement any kind of from any other side from outside. But I suppose that if such a platform would be provided, it would be only for the benefit for the peace process. But so far we don't have this. And my impression is that the international organizations still try to judge the situation and to come up with some solutions, because so many efforts and so many funds have been spent in the area. I mean, since the 1990s, millions and millions of dollars have been spent by international organizations, national society in general. I mean, all international organizations engaged in Central Asia have been working in Batken and Isfara region. I mean, they spend money for infrastructure, for discussions, for dialogues, bringing some kind of ambassadors of view, informal leaders from both sides, using the approach of peace economy, etc. It was all useless, unfortunately. So it's failed to prevent the escalation of the conflict. So I think that for the many international stakeholders, it's a time just to revise the situation, to reassess it, and probably to come up with something new, some new approaches.
Thank you, Parviz. Next question is, what are the implications for a long-term security regime underpinning the region if the CSTO lacks the capacity to address the current conflicts? Anyone feeling like responding to that?
I think it's a great question. And I mean, I think, you know, I don't have an answer, right? I think one of the things that's clearly been demonstrated, and you know, the fact that Putin gave Rahmon an award for promoting peace and stability, it sort of demonstrates the degree to which the figure of Russia as some sort of mediator through the auspices of the CSTO has been has really lost all kind of credibility in the last weeks and months. So I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, it's very difficult to envisage a sort of a local security environment in which these issues can be resolved, you know, through a sort of an international framework. I'd be interested to hear what colleagues have to say, because I'm no sort of, you know, international security analyst, but.
Well, I think Madeleine is right in the sense that I have an impression that it's a kind of reaching a deadlock in terms of regional security dialogue. For one reason, I mean, right now, neither Russia nor CSTO can be trusted really for basically bringing the two countries to negotiation. For one reason, because Russia itself is waging war, so the goals of Russia are also very unclear for the region. Is CSTO meant to really be about the region and about the regional security, or CSTO is meant to only enhance Russia's status and prestige as a regional geopolitical actor? Seems like since CSTO failed to intervene on many occasions, not only between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, between Uzbekistan and between Armenia and Azerbaijan recently, there is a growing criticism and evidence to suggest that the CSTO's goals, first of all, are not about the region and regional security. So I think more and more actors in the region began to understand that, and we now observe some distancing of Kyrgyzstan from the organization. But then the question is, who else, if not Russia and CSTO? One kind of element in the room, or one elephant in the room, is China. When China will kind of step up for the investments, the billions worth investment they made in the region, because China, just for this practical, pragmatical reason, would not be interested in the destabilization of the region. But so far, we don't see that China would take up such a role. There are other international organizations active in the region. That would be OSCE, but unfortunately, OSCE's mission in Kyrgyzstan has been diminished, and this is not because the organization wanted it. Actually, OSCE had an office in Bishkek until 2016, and it also had office in Osh. I'm not suggesting that if OSCE was still present there would be a different situation right now. No, not at all, of course. But this is also how the Kyrgyz government politics towards international organizations and cooperation with international partners worked in the past. So very, not very wise steps were made to diminish the status of OSCE. Now this, I don't know, Kyrgyz and both parts made their speeches at UN. It needs to be seen whether UN could become such a platform. But I would agree with Parviz that indeed many peace building projects and programs were in both countries with no effect really, because the problem is not on the level of communities. I think communities do want to cohabitate peacefully. Right now, I think the level of tensions and the problem is at the upper echelon of government, and there needs to be a much higher mobilization of mediation efforts, and both sides should be able to accept that authority. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we will need to conclude, but maybe let me take one more question, which I guess is a good question to wrap up a little bit this event, to try to think about the future. And the question is, what more could be done at the local level to build confidence measure among communities on either side of the border?
I would say that everything has been already done. I think that now the destiny of the local communities are in the hands of the national government. So they are decision-making entities right now. In the future, we used to have a local, so referred to local conflict, inter-community conflict. It could be referred to such. I mean, in previous times, but since 2014, approximately, this is already. The conflict started to raise to the international level, to the interstate level, and this is no more actually the question of local communities' trust. This is the trust between the governments and their willingness and ability to make concessions. And this is very difficult to do because actually they're both influenced by the internal situation, peculiarities in both countries, plus complicated the geopolitical situation in the region. And whatever happening with Ukraine and Russia, I mean, there would be a huge and big, large-scale transformation, geopolitical transformation in the entire region. And, I mean, of course, it would affect the entire political system and systems in Central Asia, and the local conflicts, the type of the conflict, the character of the conflicts. So we are actually on the eve of larger changes on many levels, on both international, regional.
Thank you, Madeleine.
I wonder if I could just, if I could just add something very shortly. I very much agree with Parviz's analysis that, in a sense, the conflict has moved from the level of local dispute into something where, in a sense, any confidence building measures at a local level of the kind that have over the last decades been initiated by local peace building organizations would have little kind of effect on the future course of conflict. That said, I think that there are significant respects in which both borderland communities feel that they have been systematically ignored by their own national governments. There is, you know, when Tashev visits Batken, he gets hounded, you know, so it's, I think one of the ways in which confidence measures can be built at a very, very basic level is through greater transparency about what exactly is being negotiated, what exactly is the content of the protocoli that are being signed by Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. What exactly are going to be the implications of withdrawing troops from the border forces? I think that's one thing, and I think Olivier Ferrando, who's a French political analyst, has done some very interesting analysis of the casualties on the Tajik side in particular, and has shown that it would seem that a lot of the border forces guarding the border here are not local. They're from Hatlon, and I think one of the significant sort of escalating factors is that if the local so-called peacekeeping forces, in the form of border guards and security services and so forth, are not sort of trusted locally, that can also be a very significant antagonizing factor. So I think that there are issues there that can be addressed within the respective national governments.
Thank you, Madeleine. Asel, would you like to add a final word?
Well, yeah, just maybe in the direction which Madeleine already began, is that this kind of measures can be taken on both governments, but I think the Kyrgyz side has a much more harder time to achieve that, because unlike consolidated authoritarianism in Tajikistan, where the central government has less sensitivity to public opinion, in Kyrgyzstan, actually, central government is very much scrutinized by the publics, and it's very difficult for the government to conceal, be secretive and manipulative about their current negotiations with the other side. And that makes also this current kind of the need for concessions also very difficult to achieve on the Kyrgyz side, because unless the tandem or doesn't want to be re-elected or even continue with their current term, they would not be able to really make concessions, because their population right now would feel very much betrayed by such movements. So it's extremely difficult right now for the government to basically to sit on the table of negotiations, because that's very much needed if we want to move forward and don't have any conflicts in the future. But at the same time, the publics which feel very much betrayed and not trustworthy of the government.
All right, thank you so much. I'm really sorry, but we are very late. We really need to conclude. There will be obviously much more to say. So I really apologize. I couldn't take all the questions, but we are going to follow the situation closely, and we're likely to organize one more event on this topic in the coming months. I mean, let's see. So I would like to thank a lot Asel, Madeleine, and Parviz for their presentations, for this great discussion. I would also like to thank our audience for being with us today, for the many questions you sent, and we look forward to having you again in one of our upcoming seminars. So thank you very much again. Have a nice day, or a nice afternoon, or a nice evening. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.